The room was quiet that October evening in 1916, too quiet for the kinds of things Carl Jung was about to say. The chairs were filled, but the walls felt closer than they should have, as if the room itself was listening. There was no official announcement, no fanfare, no publication, just a gathering of minds at the Psychological Club in Zürich and a man who had come to say something he could not say anywhere else. Something he could only share behind closed doors to those ready, or at least willing, to hear it. He didn't begin with theories, he didn't offer analysis, he spoke slowly, deliberately, as though pulling the words from a place older than language, a place beneath society, beneath psychology itself, a place where the soul still speaks. The world, Jung knew, was moving faster than it had ever moved before. Nations at war, machines replacing memory, ideologies rising like titans, and beneath it all, the individual was dissolving, melting into crowds, slogans, uniforms, and moral binaries. To survive, people were learning to adapt, to blend, to belong. But in that very act of adaptation, they were losing something vital, something irreplaceable, something sacred. That evening, Jung spoke of the most dangerous idea he had ever touched. Not the shadow, not the anima, not archetypes, but the tension between individuation and collective adaptation. And he spoke as someone who had paid the price for knowing it too well. Individuation, he explained, is not a concept, it is a transformation. It is the process by which a person becomes whole, not merely functional. It is not about fixing flaws or becoming perfect. It is about integrating the forgotten, the hidden, the dark. It is about remembering the voice within you that existed before the world told you who to be. But individuation is not convenient. It doesn't serve the state. It doesn't build economies. It doesn't help you climb social ladders or win approval. It dismantles you. It challenges everything you've adapted yourself to be. It asks a question society would rather you never ask. Who are you when no one is watching? Who are you without your masks? The collective, on the other hand, thrives on masks. It rewards imitation, punishes dissent, and sanctifies obedience. It wants your agreement, not your depth. It wants your vote, not your silence. It wants you to conform, to something, to anything, as long as it's not the unruly wilderness of your inner life. Jung had learned, through years of personal confrontation with visions, dreams, and breakdowns, that the soul does not thrive on adaptation. It thrives on authenticity, on dissent, on confrontation with what we fear in ourselves. He saw how modern people were becoming shells, externally refined, internally fractured, and he knew the reason why. We were adapting to survive in a world that had forgotten what a soul even was. He spoke that night not as a clinician, but as a witness, a man who had walked through the underworld of his own unconscious and come back carrying something unspeakable, something he hadn't dared to publish, something he'd only shared in whispers, the 7 sermons to the dead, not because it was delusion, but because it was revelation, because it had come not from his rational mind, but from the deeper strata of his being, where the individual and the eternal intersect. He said the problem with modern society is not that people are immoral, it's that they are obedient to the wrong gods, not to the gods of old, but to the gods of image, efficiency, and identity. They worship what is seen, not what is true. And so they adapt to trends, to tribes, to whatever story makes them feel safest. And in doing so, they abandon the inner voice that once whispered to them in dreams. Jung feared that the modern person was no longer capable of hearing that voice, that the collective had become too loud, too bright, too demanding. That individuation, the sacred process of becoming one's true self, was becoming extinct, buried beneath layers of social performance and psychological anesthesia. And yet, he believed there was still hope. He had to believe it, because if individuation could not survive the modern world, then neither could the soul. Jung didn't just fear the loss of the individual, he feared what would replace it. He had seen it already in the war-torn faces of Europe, in the ideologies rising like storms, in the way crowds moved like single organisms, devouring nuance, flattening contradiction. The collective wasn't just a social unit, it was a psychic force, and when a person surrendered to it, they didn't merely follow a movement, they dissolved. They became an echo of something external, something louder than their own soul. The more a person adapts to the crowd, the more they betray the voice within. And betrayal, Jung said, does not go unnoticed by the psyche. The unconscious remembers. It stores the compromise. It registers the silence. Every unspoken truth, every fear buried for the sake of harmony becomes a ghost in the system. Haunting dreams, relationships, illnesses, what cannot speak, returns in symptoms. Individuation, then, is not a luxury. It is a necessity. It is not for the privileged few. It is for anyone who wishes to be truly alive. But it costs everything. Because it means being misunderstood. It means being lonely. It means walking a path where no one can follow, because it is your path and yours alone. That is why Jung only whispered this message in certain rooms, to certain people. Not because it was elitist, but because it was dangerous, because once you hear it, you cannot unhear it. Once you know that you are called to become yourself, you can never again hide in the collective without feeling the sickness of self-betrayal. He warned that the collective doesn't just flatten difference, it pathologizes it. The person who withdraws, who questions, who lives by their inner law is often seen as sick, antisocial, unstable, strange. But Jung flipped that logic on its head. He said, perhaps it is not the individual who is sick, but the society that cannot tolerate difference. Perhaps the dreamer, the mystic, the eccentric are not broken. They are the only ones still listening. The process of individuation begins when we stop asking what others want from us and begin asking what the soul wants from us. It is not a question we answer with words. It is a descent, a pilgrimage, a dismantling of everything we thought we had to be. Jung called it the night sea journey, the terrifying voyage into the dark where the ego is swallowed and something older rises in its place. This is not a metaphor. It is a lived experience. It looks like crisis. It feels like madness. It comes in the form of breakdowns, losses, synchronicities that shake the scaffolding of your life. It pulls you away from your roles, your job, your relationships, your goals, and into something unknown, something raw. You lose your map. And that is the beginning of everything. Because only when the map is gone can the soul draw a new one. Jung knew this well. He lived it. After his split with Freud, he didn't just lose a mentor. He lost the scaffolding of his entire identity. He withdrew. He wandered. He painted mandalas, recorded dreams, dialogued with figures from the unconscious. He entered into solitude, not to escape, but to listen, to allow the psyche to reveal what it had been, silenced from saying. And what it said was this: there is no salvation in conformity. There is no meaning in being well adjusted to a broken system. To be whole is to risk exile. To be real is to risk rejection. But the cost of staying silent is far greater, because the soul does not die from attack. It dies from neglect. Jung believed the world would not be saved by mass movements or collective ideologies, but by individuals, by people willing to face the terrifying mirror of the self, people who would integrate their shadow, live their truth, and radiate a kind of presence that changes others not by force but by gravity. He didn't preach this from a stage. He whispered it, behind doors, in private papers, to those whose eyes betrayed a hunger for something deeper than adaptation. Because that hunger is sacred. It is the beginning of the return, the moment the collective no longer satisfies, and you feel something inside you stir, something ancient, something waiting. That stirring is not a call to rebel for the sake of rebellion. It is not about being contrarian or unique or free in the superficial sense of doing whatever one wants. The kind of freedom Jung spoke of is terrifying, because it is freedom from the roles that kept you safe, freedom from the identities you clung to when the world asked you to play your part. Real freedom is the beginning of accountability, not to a government, not to a group, but to the self. The self, in Jung's psychology, is not the ego. It is the totality, the wholeness of a person, conscious and unconscious, dark and light. It is what you were before you were shaped, before you were taught to pick and choose which parts of you were acceptable. The self doesn't want perfection. It wants integration. It wants the truth of who you are, even if that truth contradicts what you've been praised for, even if it means walking away from everything you were told would make you happy. This is what makes individuation so incompatible with collective adaptation. The collective demands simplicity, but the self is complexity incarnate, The collective wants loyalty. The self demands honesty. The collective offers belonging. The self calls for solitude. And yet, something miraculous happens when you answer the call to individuate. At first, you fall apart, you lose your bearings, you descend. But over time, as you integrate what was rejected, as you honor what was silenced, you begin to radiate a strange kind of power, a quiet strength, a clarity, a presence. And people notice, not because you're trying to be anything, but because you are no longer trying to be anything. You have become real. That is the paradox Jung discovered in those hidden years of inner descent. When you stop adapting to the world begins to change around you. Not because it bends to your will, but because your presence reveals what others have been avoiding. And some will be drawn to it, and some will run from it. But either way, you will have stepped into the sacred responsibility of being truly alive. Jung did not believe that individuation ends in detachment or isolation. He believed that once the individual becomes whole, they are able to contribute to the collective in a new way, not as a puppet, not as a mirror, but as a beacon. Not everyone must become a mystic or a depth psychologist, but everyone, Jung believed, must at some point confront the unconscious if they wish to live fully. Because the unconscious is not just where the darkness lives, it is where the soul lives. And when we deny it, when we live only for approval, only for efficiency, only for what can be measured, we become hollow, productive, perhaps, polite, agreeable, but inwardly starved. That is the secret Jung was trying to communicate in that quiet room in 1916. Not in bold claims or sweeping declarations, but in the trembling honesty of a man who had crossed a line he could never uncross. He had glimpsed the cost of being real. He had seen what happens when you stop trying to fit in and start trying to become whole, and it changed everything. He knew that individuation wasn't just a psychological process, it was a spiritual one. And that is what made it so dangerous in the eyes of society. Because a truly individuated person cannot be manipulated. They cannot be conscripted by ideology. They cannot be coerced into betraying their soul. And so, they are seen as threats, not because they threaten others, but because they remind others of what they've given up. The individuated person becomes a mirror. And mirrors are terrifying when you're trying not to see yourself. This is why Jung never insisted that the collective be destroyed or abandoned. He wasn't calling for anarchy. He understood its necessity, the need for shared myths, social cohesion, and order. But what he warned against was a collective that demands submission rather than participation. A collective that punishes deviation, not because it is dangerous, but because it exposes its own fragility. In Jung's time, Europe was still reeling from war, nationalism, religious upheaval. The idea of a strong, unified identity, national, religious, political, seemed like salvation. But Jung saw something deeper. He saw that these identities, when left unexamined, become masks, and when the mask becomes the face, the soul begins to rot. He once wrote that a man who has not passed through the inferno of his passions has never overcome them. What he meant was that real morality, real clarity, does not come from blind obedience or inherited belief. It comes from confrontation, with the shadow, with desire, with death. And only someone who has walked into their own darkness and come out the other side can speak with authority about light. This is what the collective fears. It fears the one who has gone into the wilderness and returned speaking a different language. A language not of control or conformity, but of symbol, intuition, and paradox. The modern world, Jung knew, is built to resist such voices. It prefers predictability. It prefers utility. It prefers people who serve a function and don't ask questions that unsettle the frame. But Jung's entire life was an unsettling of the frame. The 7 sermons to the dead were not an accident. They were not a footnote. They were the beginning of his deepest realization, that psychology, to be real, must include the soul. And the soul is not collective. The soul is personal, not individualistic in the ego sense, but individual in the mythic sense. Each soul is a world, and each world must be journeyed through in solitude before it can contribute to the whole. This is why Jung placed so much value on dreams, on active imagination, on symbols that arise spontaneously from within, because they are the compass points of the self, not imposed by doctrine, not extracted from books, but emerging from the living depth of one's own experience. An experience cannot be collectivized. You cannot mass-produce awakening. You cannot organize transcendence. You cannot write a guidebook for the soul's descent and rebirth. At best, you can offer symbols, stories, pathways, never maps. This is why Jung remained, to the end, a solitary figure. He belonged to no school. He built no church. He offered no definitive system, because he understood that the minute a truth becomes a rule, it begins to die. So he whispered instead of shouted. He placed his deepest revelations in strange texts and private talks, not because he was uncertain, but because he respected the inner journey too much to let it be packaged and sold. The message he gave in 1916 wasn't just psychological, it was prophetic. He saw what would come if the collective swallowed the individual, if people surrendered their inner life for the comfort of belonging. He saw what would rise in its place: totalitarianism, groupthink, mass neurosis, and he knew the cure was not rebellion, not revolution, but individuation, the slow, painful, heroic task of becoming a soul. Jung never claimed that individuation would lead to happiness nor to social success. It might lead to misunderstanding, to exile, to long nights of silence where the world you once trusted no longer makes sense. It might isolate you from the very people who once called you sane. But individuation is not about being accepted. It's about becoming real. And reality for Jung was always paradoxical, both beautiful and terrifying. Because to be whole, you must be willing to house contradictions. You must be able to say, I am both light and shadow, both form and formlessness. I am the mask, and I am what lies behind it. This is why the collective, as necessary as it may be, can never carry the full weight of a soul. It can only carry the appearance. It needs masks to function, and this is not a flaw. It is simply a limitation. But when we begin to confuse the mask for the self, we fall into what Jung called spiritual possession. We lose our center, not to gods, but to roles. We become consumed by ideas of what we should be, rather than listening for what we truly are. He once observed that the world will ask you who you are, and if you do not know, the world will tell you. And this is the subtle violence of collective adaptation. It replaces your silence with noise, your symbols with slogans, your soul with a template. The path of individuation, then, is not a rejection of society. It is a return to it, with depth, with authenticity, with the hard-earned truth of your own experience. You do not escape the collective. You re-enter it with awareness, with new eyes, with the ability to say no, not out of rebellion, but out of clarity. And this clarity is what the world so desperately needs. Not more systems, not more ideologies, but individuals who have touched their inner source. This is the paradox Jung understood, that the more you become yourself, the more you actually contribute to the healing of the collective. Because your wholeness radiates, it liberates, it reminds others of their own buried voice. But if you betray yourself for the sake of the group, you bring only more fragmentation into the world, more performance, more hollowness dressed as virtue. That's why Jung's secret message in 1916 was not for everyone. It was not for the masses. It was for those who had already begun to feel the cracking of the surface, for those who had seen through the veil of consensus reality, for those who could no longer breathe inside the costumes they were told to wear. And for those people, the message was simple. You are not crazy. You are waking up. You are being called, not to flee but to descend, to step into the psychic underworld and face the things that the world has told you to ignore, to speak with your own dead, to translate the symbols rising from your dreams into something living, to become not better, but whole. Because the world does not need perfect people. It needs real ones. It needs those who have stared into the abyss and come back with something to say. Not a doctrine, not a slogan, but a voice that trembles with the weight of having been there. Jung went there. In his solitude, in his silence, in that private room in 1916, where he let the dead speak and refused to censor what they said, he told the truth quietly. And maybe that's why it still echoes. Not because it was loud, but because it was real. And in a world addicted to performance, the real is revolutionary. So if you ever feel yourself pulled away from the crowd, from the roles, the scripts, the carefully curated truths, don't panic. You're not being broken, you're being summoned, and the ones who summoned you are ancient. They are not bound by language or culture or time. They are waiting for you in your dreams, in your symbols, in the silence behind your daily thoughts. And when you meet them, they won't ask you to conform. They'll ask you to remember, to descend, to become the self you were always meant to be, before the world told you who you had to be. That is the message Jung could only say in secret, and now it is yours.